during Easter Easter Sunday, it's important to discuss what Islam has to say about this issue. Now, there's two passages that mention the disappearance or the death of Jesus, or the crucifixion and the crucifixion of Jesus, not the death, but the crucifixion and disappearance of Jesus. And the first place is the Quran, chapter 3, verse 55, where God tells Jesus, "Oh, Jesus, I will cause you to die and raise you up to myself." Now, the Arabic word die does not necessarily mean like a physical death. The Arabic word used in Quran, chapter 3, verse 55 could mean sleep. So the Quran chapter 3 verse 55 says, "Oh Jesus, I will cause you, I will take you and raise you up onto myself." Other translations translate the Quran chapter 3 verse 55 as, "Oh Jesus, I will terminate your stay on earth. Oh Jesus, I will cancel your mission on earth and raise you up onto myself," etc. So that's the first part in the Quran, chapter 3, verse 55 says, God will raise Jesus to Himself. The second part, or the second verse that talks about the crucifixion of Jesus is the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, where the Quran says they didn't kill Jesus, nor did they crucify Him, but it was only made to appear to them, but God took Him onto Himself. In the Quran, chapter 4, verse 158 says God took Jesus or raised Jesus to Himself. Now, there's different interpretations of the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157. And there's a key passage in the Quran, chapter 3, verse 55, which makes the most sense given the early historical records, being the New Testament writings and the writings of Paul, meaning the letters of Paul, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts of the Apostles, etc., etc. Given the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, the standard narrative or the standard commentary on the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, going back to Ibn Abbas and what Ibn Kathir says, etc. It says that somebody else was put on the cross instead of Jesus. Some people say Judas, some people say some other disciple, and Jesus got away from the crucifixion. In other words, Jesus was never nailed to the cross, but somebody else was put on the cross instead, and God raised Jesus to Himself. And that other person was crucified. Now, not every interpretation of the Quran is correct. Just because some commentators say that doesn't mean the Quran is saying that, right? This is just the opinion of people like Ibn Kathir, Ibn Abbas, etc., etc. But their opinions about this matter may or may not be correct. So basically, not every interpretation of the Quran, especially when it comes to this issue, could be regarded as correct. Keep in mind that the people who wrote the tafsirs were just human beings. Sometimes they would just have to use their best. They would have to use their best judgment to write about certain issues. So not everything in there necessarily has to be correct. What I think the Quran chapter 4 verse 157 is talking about, in line with the Quran chapter 3 verse 55, and which is in line with the New Testament documents, is that the key passage really arises in the Quran chapter 3 verse 55, where it says, "Oh Jesus, I will cause you to die," not death as in physical death, but God will cause Jesus to go to sleep, and in his sleep He will raise Jesus onto Himself. So basically what may have happened is Jesus was actually crucified, but He was alive. God kept Jesus alive through the whole ordeal. Jesus survived the whipping and the torture and the scourging before the crucifixion. If He survived all that, then He would definitely survive the crucifixion. Keep in mind, if you read the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, if you read the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, Jesus is only on the cross for a few hours. Death by crucifixion typically took days. So that's the first part. That's the first point. The second point is, why can't God keep Jesus alive? well, let's not even bring Jews into this, but Christians and Muslims believe in the supernatural. In a world where God exists, in a world where God exists, God could definitely keep people alive through the crucifix, through whatever ordeal they're going through, whether they're swallowed up by a whale like Jonah was, or they were put on the cross like Jesus was. God could definitely keep them alive. So that's the second part. That's the second point. The third point is that according to the very earliest New Testament writing, which is the Q Gospel, Jesus was assumed from the tomb into heaven. Um, you know, in other words, Jesus was not resurrected, but he was assumed. He was put on the cross, and he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. He was buried in a tomb, and then from the tomb, God took Jesus and raised him up onto Himself. We find some evidence for this in the Q Gospel, and we find some evidence for this in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, no one sees Jesus rise from the dead. In other words, nobody sees the crucifixion, or nobody sees the actual resurrection of Jesus. Jesus is crucified, he's taken down, and then he is buried in the empty tomb. But nobody actually sees the resurrection. If you read the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, etc., Jesus, the women followers of Jesus find the tomb empty, and the angels say he is risen. But the women followers don't actually see Jesus rise from the dead. They don't actually see what went on in the tomb. They're just told to go to Jerusalem or Galilee. There's contradictions in the Gospels of where Jesus actually appeared after the crucifixion. But anyways, they're told to go to either Jerusalem or Galilee. After that, it gets it gets more murky, because when the disciples see Jesus, let's go to the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark ended in the Gospel of Mark chapter 16 verse 8. A few hundred years later, the other verses were added. So there was no resurrection in the Gospel of Mark. How do I know this? Because the Bible itself, because any kind of Bible you have actually admits that the resurrection of Jesus, according to the earliest Gospel, which is Mark, is a later fabrication. Let me show you the evidence. So I have the Archaeological Study Bible. I have the Archaeological Study Bible, and if we go to the part of the Gospel of Mark, one second, let me just get to Mark real quick. Okay, if we go to the Gospel of Mark, it ends in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 8. It says, "Trembling and bewitched, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." So then it says the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 to 20. And then it says in the footnote, "Does serious doubt exist whether these verses belong to the Gospel of Mark? They are absent from important early manuscripts." So basically, according to the Archaeological Study Bible, page 1662, there was no resurrection of Jesus. It was later added on. So basically, we see that according to the earliest gospel, Jesus is crucified. He's put in the tomb, but we don't. But when the women come, there was no resurrection of Jesus. When the women come to the tomb, all it says, the angel says, "He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they lay him." So basically, nobody actually sees the resurrection of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. So this gives credence that God raised Jesus from the tomb into heaven. And then there were appearances of Jesus according to the Gospel of Matthew, Luke, and John. But if you read the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John, the post-resurrection, or the post-resurrection appearances, or the post-crucified Jesus appearances, these appearances seem visionary. In other words, if you read the Gospel of Matthew, according to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, verse 17, reports that only some people who actually saw Jesus worshipped him while others doubted it was him. Why would some who saw Jesus doubt it was him? The gospel, the other gospels provide some clues that might explain this, and which also make the appearance of Jesus doubtful in their own right. Jesus did not look like Jesus, but someone else they didn't recognize. So basically, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, verse 17, reports that only some people who actually saw Jesus worshipped him, while others doubted it was him. So this gives credence to the idea that this post crucified Jesus, or this post empty tomb Jesus, was actually a vision given to the disciples instead of an actual flesh and blood being in front of them. So this gives credence that after the crucifixion, after the empty tomb, they had visions of Jesus, and they didn't recognize it was him. It didn't. In other words, this Jesus did not look like Jesus, but someone else they didn't recognize. So all this is in line with the post resurrected Jesus, or the post crucified Jesus, being a vision instead of a flesh and blood person. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 12, records that Jesus appeared in a different form. The Greek word is phanero, and in a passive voice, which means he was made known, he was revealed, or he became known, became famous. The choice of verb suggests and certainly allows that it is a vision being described. So if you read the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 12, it records that Jesus appeared in a different form. So this is further proof, or this is further evidence, that the disciples saw a vision of Jesus, a vision or some kind of projection, a holographic projection of Jesus, and it's not, and the disciples didn't see a flesh and blood Jesus, like a physical flesh and blood Jesus in front of them. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 12, the Greek verb um, implies that he was made known and he was revealed. In other words, he was revealed to them in a vision, not a physical flesh and blood form. This, this shows that the post-crucified appearances of Jesus and the post-empty tomb appearances of Jesus were visionary of nature and not a flesh and blood appearance of Jesus. If you read there, I'm just focusing on the Gospel of Matthew and Mark just to save time, but this is further established if you read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John, which even conservative Christian scholars put after the Gospel of Matthew and Luke. If you read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John, well, if you just read the Gospel of Luke, there seems to be an emphasis on the flesh and blood Jesus. And if you read the Gospel of John, this is further established. Jesus actually eats, boiled fish and honeycomb in front of the disciples to show that he's a flesh and blood being. But this wasn't being taught in the earlier Gospels, Mark and Matthew. Mark and Matthew clearly taught a visionary post crucified Jesus. So the important part here that gives credence, or is further proof that God took Jesus from the tomb into heaven, and that validates the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157, is the important part in the New Testament is that in all the gospel accounts, the gospels being Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, nobody sees Jesus rise from the dead. They only observe a missing body, and later are visited by visions or appearances of Jesus. This gives credence that Jesus was taken from the tomb and directly taken into heaven. This is also affirmed in the Q Gospel. Again, if you read Daniel A. Smith's book, The Empty Tomb, he explains this in greater detail, and I'll be given the I'll be posting the link for that. It's called Revisiting the Empty Tomb, The Early History of Easter by Daniel A. Smith, and I'll be posting that link from Amazon.com in the description below. So basically, stay tuned for part 2, which will explain how Paul of Tarsus made up the death and resurrection of Jesus, and how the disciples were preaching a different Jesus than Paul's Jesus.